Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Woodburn Accountants and Advisors workshop series on company audit, tax, and employee compliance in China. You have joined us for part one on how to avoid fraud and manage human resources in foreign invested enterprises. Have you developed corporate governance in your China company? Do you have control over your China organization? Do you have preventative measures against fraud? Are you aware that a China company must perform a year-end audit and complete annual tax compliance filings? Are you familiar with the deadlines of these annual government inspections and compliance procedures? Do you know how to implement these functions within your organization? So at Woodburn, we're offering this complimentary workshop series on compliance in China in order to help you with the various pain points associated with annual compliance, fraud, and individual or human resource requirements as well. So today you've joined us for part one of this webinar series. If you are having trouble managing employees in China, if you're losing control over your organization, or you're struggling to build a strong and productive team, or simply put, you actually have experienced fraud in China, then this webinar session will help you to overcome these frustrations. So what are we covering today? What we're covering today is factors that contribute to fraud and corporate governance. We're going to be looking at proven strategies that will help you to avoid fraud, and we will look at how to develop a corporate governance in your China company. Now, how the process works with these webinar series, I'm trying out something new because I want people to become a lot more interactive with me. My webinar series, I teach. And in this webinar series, I'm going to be asking you guys a bunch of different questions. So please answer them in the chat box. Be interactive with me. At any point that you have a question, insert it inside the chat box. I will answer those questions, okay? I'm going to be staying on until every question is answered, and ultimately what I want is that this becomes a valuable spend of your time. So I'm not going to be distributing the webinar presentation or the recording. Take notes, grab yourselves a pen and paper. Maybe you guys want to switch off your phones in order that you're not distracted and that you can focus on today's presentation. My goal is not to be selling to you. I am honestly here to educate you and help you with any questions or situations you're incurring right now regarding your companies in China. So why should you be concerned by fraud in China? Well, because it does exist, right? And most likely when it happens, you are going to be utterly taken by surprise that you won't know how to react. You won't know where to go to. You won't know what to do, okay? The other thing is, most of you have probably entered the Chinese market with extremely high expectations on a new market and a new business culture. It's very common. So with these high expectations going into the market, your focus is going to be on the day-to-day business. So if you're selling into China, your focus is going to be on sales. That anything else that is occurring, well, you're going to be like a horse with blinders. You're probably going to ignore it, okay? And obviously that can lead to fraud issues as well. And most of you, if you're on this webinar session, might not necessarily be residing in China. You might be sitting in your head office abroad. So because you're not physically on the ground, you might misplace your trust and loyalty in your employees or also other third parties, suppliers, customers, etc., which again could lead to fraud. It could also lead to tremendous complacency by you. So the last but most important thing, and I say this through my own experience, is it can and probably will happen to you at some point in your China journey. Fraud is probably inevitable because from day one, you are not focusing on procedures, internal guidelines, etc., which is fair enough. You're going into the market with very high expectations to develop your business and grow your business in the core activities that you know. So everything else will become sort of a moot point. Every single person that I have met that has done business in China has experienced some form of fraud. Okay? So what I want to do is ask you, for those of you that have been doing business in China, who has experienced fraud? Put it into the chat box, into the question section of the control panel, or either question section or the chat box, and let me know, have you experienced fraud? Did you go into the Chinese market with very high expectations? Did you misplace your trust and loyalty in certain individuals when you came into the market? Please do add your comments into the chat section of today's webinar. Just to move on, while you're going through and adding your comments, you have got to protect yourself. And there are so many areas in which you do have to protect yourself, okay? So I've listed here 7 areas that I think are quite critical in order to protect yourself. One would be intellectual property, copywriting, patents. The second is developing a corporate governance regulation system or internal guidelines. You've got to make sure you've got due diligence procedures in place in order to make sure that you're vetting partners, customers, suppliers. If you've incorporated your entity, you've got to protect those company chops, licenses, and know who's holding them at any one point in time. You've got to develop system processes for trade transactions, for service transactions, primarily so you can avoid kickbacks, but more importantly, that you also educate yourself on the system process, that you've developed a system for your employees to follow and act as a guideline that you know is the correct way in terms of doing business in China. You want to control inventory. You want to control warehousing systems. There's so many other areas as well that you may want to control. I didn't even mention in this one just simply controlling employees, employees in, employees out, looking at the financials. There's so many other areas that you want to develop system processes in order to protect your entity, but more importantly, if you are a shareholder, that you want to protect yourself as well. So how can I actually help you, or why am I able to help you? My name is Christina Kohler-Coluccia. I work for Woodburn Accountants and Advisors. I'm the head of business advisory there. I have been a leading expert on inbound investment into China for the last 16 years. I've been solely focused on corporate services and compliance in China. I've written hundreds of articles on investment into China, worked with over 500 international companies on their market strategy, implementation, and growth. I've been a speaker on numerous China-specific associations, and I'm also the creator of the China Roadmap program, which I will also touch on in today's presentation. But I think most importantly, why am I able to help you? Because my personal journey in China has actually been a roller coaster ride of highs and lows. In many instances in this presentation, I will be using my own personal stories to explain how I've also been affected by fraud, where I've also seen warning signs or red flags. My biggest focus when I speak to clients today is preemption by action is the best form of protection in China. You want to prevent yourself from getting into any form of difficulty or trouble in the Chinese market. And I've developed systems and processes to help companies be protected and be able to sleep at night. So just so you're aware, we have free articles and publications. If you're interested in subscribing to them, you can do so on our website at woodburnglobal.com. Every Monday goes out a e-campaign with the latest news, articles, etc. Or you can follow the company or myself on LinkedIn, and we also have a YouTube channel where we have a bunch of different content on there as well that's free of charge. So this webinar is for you if you are a newbie to China. So if you're on this webinar and you don't have an entity in China, but you're looking or have already found an opportunity to do business in China, and you're just trying to learn, you're educating yourself on how to protect your business. So in today's presentation, I won't just be looking at fraud issues when you have your own entity in China, but also fraud issues that surround transactions that are occurring with China as well. If you're a startup in China, for me, that would mean you would have had a company in China for a period of 1 to 3 years. You've been so focused on your core business, and you realize now that you need to start developing protection strategies as situations have arisen. They've been controllable, but your fear now is that they might start getting out of hand. Even if you're experienced China hand, you have been in China forever, you've also experienced fraud, you've had your own journey, and you're here today because you want to have fresh updates, fresh ideas on how to better control and protect your company. So for all of these categories, this is why this webinar session might be useful to you. So please, in the chat box again, give me a bit of background about who you are. Are you a newbie? Are you a startup? Or are you an experienced China hand? Just type those in and add them into the chat box so that I have a sense of who you are on today's presentation. Now, I want to emphasize this throughout today's presentation, which is luck is not a strategy. Now, when I was a newbie in China, and this again was 16 years ago, my technique for educating myself and for researching what was happening on the market was absolutely wrong. I just read articles that I found on the internet. And mind you, I never even checked the publication dates of those articles. So probably about a good 60% of what I read was outdated. And I think my biggest mistake, even though I was setting up a corporate services firm in China, was that I did not have a coach. I didn't have an advisor. I did not have somebody guiding me with my growth in China. I actually, honestly, based everything on luck. I had a very small business plan. I had a tiny, non-detailed budget. And what happened within the first 8 months of being in China, being in Shanghai, I went through a termination procedure whereby I didn't get advice on how to do it. I didn't get advice on the laws and regulations that were needed to terminate. And what happened was what happened to follow was that I had a 2-month nightmare and a cost of over 100,000 renminbi because I did not have an advisor on hand. And that cost me my entire budget for the year. I was in my slow startup period, and I could have actually killed my business just because I didn't get an advisor to speak to. And when I say advisor, this could be anybody. It could be a lawyer, it could be an accountant, it could be an HR professional, it could be a marketing professional, it could be whomever you need as an expert to guide you and coach you on what is allowed and what is permitted and what you should be doing to protect yourself. What happened to me was the fact that when I terminated this employee used their entire leverage on the fact that I knew nothing to get what she wanted in terms of compensation. All right. And lo and behold, I honestly felt like an idiot at the end because I also, on top of everything else, lost money in the process. And when you are a newbie or you're a startup in China, that's something you can't afford to let happen. So I do know that in 2002, 2003, 2004, when most of my friends and I were starting up our businesses in China, you know, our common motto was, oh, we're so lucky. And then, you know, what happens is when the luck runs out, you really do get yourself into trouble, and the end cost to fix it outweighs everything else, because for many people, it means that they actually have to exit the market. So I want to refresh what we're covering today. And the first one is something that honestly, it resonates completely with me. What are we covering today? Imagine what your life would be like if you had a China subsidiary and knew that everything happening there was in compliance. how much better would you sleep at night? I can tell you the amounts of sleepless nights I had in my first 5-6 years in China. It's uncountable, because I was under so much stress and pressure to grow the business, but worried at every corner that someone was going to take advantage of me like they did in my first year. So, you know, the fact that you can sleep at night sitting in your headquarters knowing that your entity is running smoothly. Imagine what your life would be like knowing day in and day out what was going on in your China business, but you're sitting in your head office. How amazing would that be if you got daily updates? Imagine what your life would be like when you recognize warning signs, when you recognize red flags, and you already have a solution on hand to fix it immediately, or you have your ecosystem of advisors and protectors to guide you through that period. So my goal for today is to show you how you can achieve these three things when having a China subsidiary. So let's look at what are people's pain points in China, or what I see as the biggest problems that lead to fraud. And probably all of you that are focused on the physical core activities, you don't realize this, right? But this is what I'm seeing as an outsider. The first is the lack of control and communication. And what do I mean by this? Well, you have set up a China subsidiary, probably from the US, Canada, Europe, or Australia, where first of all, you have time zone issues. So you don't have too many hours in the day to communicate with your China subsidiary. And the second is probably the physical communication. There are language barriers that do exist, although we're now in 2019, almost 2020, this should not be such an issue in terms of communication, because communication levels have increased dramatically in the Chinese market, that almost everybody does speak fluent English and can get around with English. But the lack of control and communication is the following, and these are the excuses that I hear from companies and clients and individuals. One is, oh, you know, time zone issues. I'm never able to reach my staff or my clients. Well, there's no more excuse. You have WeChat now. You are connected 24/7. You are able to communicate at any point in the day or time. And trust me, the Chinese people love WeChat, and they are on WeChat literally 24/7. So in terms of not being able to communicate or having time zone issues, that's not an issue any longer. The other was that nobody ever travels to China, or it's becoming something that is less and less frequent. Maybe one trip a year, two trips a year. You've got to imagine, you've got a team of people that are sitting in China, or if you don't have an office in China, you are transacting with companies in China that need to be controlled a little bit. Everyone at some point does get complacent. So you need to have people that travel over, look, see, physically be on the ground to understand what is going on in the market. I can tell you very openly that I have a lot of clients in China, so the physical people that are based in China, who use me as an intermediary to explain what is actually happening in the Chinese market so that the head office can understand, because no one is bothering to take a plane and visit and understand what's going on in terms of transactions, in terms of how banking systems work, in terms of all of these. I'm sort of like the negotiator saying, yes, what your staff is saying is true, it's real. Come out to China, see it for yourself, have these types of meetings. So lack of control and communication and becoming complacent is probably one of the top issues that I see in terms of small, medium-sized companies not being able to go that step in terms of growth, but also where then you're leaving your staff or your clients or whomever to take advantage of you, to create fraud. You're giving them like the key to do it. The second is turning a blind eye. And probably point 2 and point 3 lead into each other. What happens most of the times in terms of turning a blind eye, and what I mean by this is most companies will probably have started out in the Chinese market by hiring someone on the ground, probably not in the most legal way. And eventually, as the business has grown, they decide to establish an entity. And because they already have trust in this individual who has probably worked with them for a year or two and has been focusing on sales and developing and growing the business, they rely on this individual to handle all of the corporate functions and compliance procedures associated with setting up a company. And I can tell you, when that occurs, when you don't have an expert in the field of corporate compliance or incorporation or any of those functions handle that work, trust me, it's never right. Okay, you have hired an individual to grow your business. He is a sales expert in your field. Do not expect him to then become a finance expert if he has never dealt with a full P&L for a company. Okay, don't expect him to know how to incorporate an entity. And then don't be surprised when 3 years later, the entity was never established and there were no finance procedures in place. You've never even read a P&L because you've never asked to read a P&L. And after 3 years, you're wondering why, and finally you start asking questions. Placing too much faith and trust and loyalty in someone that is actually quite fresh in your company and not getting or building your ecosystem to have more people involved will cause problems down the line. And don't forget, most importantly, this individual has complete leverage over you because you haven't been doing anything legally for 3 years. Okay, you've never even asked how payroll has been paid. So don't be surprised if things aren't working out if you don't ask the questions. This leads obviously on to ethical situations. Now, I always get very frustrated that people assume that in China, any way of doing business under table is the norm. It is not the norm, okay? Doing business in China is like doing business in Germany. It's like doing business in the US. There are laws and regulations that you need to abide by in order to do business ethically, okay? So if you get a gut feeling that a transaction is occurring that just doesn't make sense, you've never experienced the system that you're being asked to follow, raise questions. That is a red flag. If your gut is telling you, I've never done this, okay, don't say, well, it's China, I assume that's how it works. If you're already using the word assume, it's wrong. Educate yourself. Find out whether it is the correct way of doing that form of transaction. You don't want to handle transactions in China that are illegal, unethical, where actually in the end of the day, you don't even get paid, okay? Or you've agreed to all the terms and conditions because you're so excited by the opportunity and you lose out on money because you never made the proper calculations for the return on investment. So beware of ethical situations. Remember that for every unethical situation you put yourself into, there is somebody on the ground in China that has leverage over you in a market that probably you find scary and complex. And then you get worried. And then fear starts putting up, and maybe at some point you decide to exit the market where actually, if you had paid attention, the opportunity would have just let you grow. The last is inexperienced but cheap staff. It is very common in China for a lot of smaller, medium-sized companies to also do business trips in China with translators. They really like this translator and they decide that they want to hire this translator full-time to build the business and run the business. I laugh a little bit because it's a translator. It's not somebody who is an expert on sales. It is not somebody who is an expert on running a company. It's a translator, right? So be aware of who you are hiring in what roles. And remember that those individuals in those roles, that is their expertise. Their experience is in there. Don't also rely on fresh graduates to help you to grow and develop your business. I think the fresh graduates are great support systems, but they should not be initially the managers that run and develop your business in China. You do need to spend money on the people that are going to help you to grow your business. And when you spend money on the more mature individuals, the ones who have had 5, 10, 15 years of experience, you're less likely to run into fraud than really the fresh graduates who have very little work experience and will make mistakes probably by accident that will lead to situations of fraud. And ultimately, you being the owner of the company are responsible for that. So, having listed these 4 areas where I really see the biggest problems that lead to fraud, do add into the chat section, have you experienced any of those? Be honest with yourself. Have you been complacent? Have you turned a blind eye? Have you run into ethical situations where you've just said, well, this is China, we'll just go ahead and do it? Have you hired inexperienced but cheap staff? Add it into the chat section, interact with me, communicate with me. It gives me a bit of background about who you are. So, what are the 4 solutions that will let you sleep at night? And this is probably a good starting point to guide you on a program that I've developed called the China Roadmap. But the first one is educate yourself on your business. This should be the first step that you do. It is important that if you are doing business in China and you're transacting with China, you understand every single part of that supply chain. You understand how the transaction physically works in China, whether you're selling into China or exporting from China. If you're offering a service locally, understand contracts. You need to have one. Understand invoicing terms, tax implications, so that nobody can have leverage over you. My real saying is in China, knowledge is power. The more you know, the less it will lead you to fraud, okay? If I had educated myself on the labor regulations and how to terminate someone, I would have not lost 100,000 renminbi, all right? It's my fault. I didn't educate myself properly. I didn't speak to people who could have guided me and made me understand what I need to know to build and develop my business, okay? If you do have an entity in China, know what is your prescribed business scope. Understand what you're allowed to do under that business scope. Understand the regulations and laws associated with having a company on the ground. Get up-to-date information on what are the newest laws and regulations that occur, okay? Build yourself that ecosystem of people that can give you that information. The next step is having another set of eyes guiding you. And again, I'm not here to sell you. I'm trying to relate. This is, again, something that I relate to because I didn't have another set of eyes guiding me. I ran into many difficulties in my first 5 years of operating in China with my own entity. And I didn't have an advisor. I didn't have someone guiding me, telling me what I could and could not do. Having another set of eyes on your business, it allows you to really focus on your business. So for example, this could mean that you do, again, have a lawyer, have an accountant, have an HR professional who does recruitment processes for you to really find the right people for your business. That you have a marketing professional that is branding your company the way it should be branded in the Chinese market. That you have a PR company that can guide you in case there is, well, fraud that pops up. You want to have this ecosystem of people that can look on your business, protect your business, and give you the warning signs as well as the red flags that might occur. Don't forget that having this ecosystem of people, they can be your independent managers, right? Telling you when something doesn't feel right or doesn't look right, from contracts to financial information to simply recruiting someone. So have this fresh set of eyes, develop this ecosystem, and trust me, there are thousands, well, not thousands, there are billions of people in the market, but there are also, a lot of experts on the market that can guide you in that way. And the third point is, please spend time on creating internal operational guidelines and management directives. And here I want to use a very good example. When I'm working with clients about hiring their first employees, either I give them employment contract templates or they'll work with a law firm to create the employment contracts. but what they never want to spend money on is the employee handbooks. Actually, the employee guidelines that will dictate what employees can and cannot do in the company. They don't want to spend money on that. They just want to spend money on the real criteria, which is having a contract. The employee handbook is what will guide you and what will also guide the employee in terms of behavioral issues, in terms of doing any under-table activity, in terms of breach of contract. The employee handbook gives you the ability to fire and terminate the individual. Again, something I did not have in my early days. So create internal operational guidelines. And by this, I mean everything from employee handbooks to CHOP management, to system processes, financial directives, management directives. Okay, have these guidelines in place. They are tools that can help you, honestly, to sleep at night and to guide your business smoothly to growth. All right. The next is hire experts in your field, please. Hire qualified individuals. Again, use recruitment agencies to help you to find those experts in your field, whether that is salespeople, managers, merchandisers, marketing professionals. Hire the right people that you need for your industry and sector. And if you can't find them, try and outsource to providers that are the experts until you have the ability to then find those people as you're developing your network in the market. But definitely hire experts in the field and make sure they are doing what they are there to do, right? Don't expect a salesperson to all of a sudden be required to analyze financial management reports, okay? A salesperson, they only care about top line. They're not going to know how to read the rest or, do financial controlling. It's not their expertise. If you hire a manager, a general manager, they might have that expertise, but not someone who's just in sales. So make sure you are hiring the people, and that, if you're asking them to do more things that are outside of their general scope of responsibility, if you feel over time that they're not right for those certain responsibilities, remove it from their responsibility list, okay? And find somebody else who has the ability to do it. So again, give me a bit of background about yourselves, right? What have you, obviously, I've asked you whether you've encountered periods of fraud. Have you been able to implement any of these solutions? If you have, add it into the chat box and let me again know a little bit how you've been able to accomplish yourselves. Now, again, I said it earlier and I'm going to say it again. Preemption by action is your best and least expensive form of protection. So what can you do to protect yourself? What actions can you take? Well, the first is create internal operational guidelines and management directives. Have a guideline on CHOP usage. Have a guideline on how licenses can be used or touched. Create system processes. Have an employee handbook. There are so many things that you can create. And again, there are people out there that can develop these guidelines for you, okay? Lawyers, part of their main activity. Accountants, especially on the financial side of things. Use your ecosystem and your network to develop these internal guidelines and processes. The next is start doing health checks and internal audits. This is probably the most easiest thing to do. Why do I say that it's an advantage? Well, again, you are either doing things in-house or you're outsourcing. It is just a very simple way of vetting that your company is healthy. Or if you look at it in another way, how can I improve the processes that are occurring in my company? How can I become more efficient that then I can grow faster? Ultimately, everyone's goal in China is to grow and become profitable. It's to grow, it's to grow, it's to grow, it's to grow. But if you don't have these internal efficiency processes in place, there's no way for you to grow because your staff are kind of lost. They don't know what direction to go to. They don't know what they can and cannot do. And nobody's flying over to give them that direction, okay? So every so often, do health checks, do internal audits. You don't necessarily have to look at the finances. I remember doing an internal audit for a company in Shanghai, and we found out that they had actually, again, without getting advice, decreased their salespeople base salary. That's illegal. If you've started off with some, and mind you, responsibilities didn't change. So you cannot, by law, decrease someone's salary if their role and responsibility and position has not changed. Okay? You can't decrease it. You can leave it the same, but you can't decrease it. You can look at other forms of commission that might be reduced. Base salary cannot be lowered. And they had no clue. They had asked every single employee to sign a document saying that they would agree to a pay decrease. And at that time, the employees didn't argue. They kind of knew that the situation in the market wasn't great. But if they would have fired one of those employees, that employee would have had every right to go to the Labor Arbitration Bureau and argue about a decrease in salary. And the penalties would have been extremely high for the company. So just by going in, doing an internal audit, looking at the HR department, look at finance, look at inventory, do warehouse checks, physical warehouse checks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It will help you to know that your business is healthy, that you're getting advice on how to improve processes, make them more efficient so that your focus can be on growth. The next is looking at the appointment of directors and senior management personnel. And there are several precautions that can be implemented to protect investors, their investment, as well as the individuals that are appointed in these very senior roles. I'm not going to go through corporate structure here, so I might be throwing out terminology that you're not familiar with. If you do have a question on it, please do let me know in the chat box. And again, I'm here to answer you, right? So the first is, you do need to appoint a legal representative that is the face to the company. You can't imagine the amount of terminations of legal representatives that I've seen that have not gone well at all. And the legal representative, generally, being that he is legally speaking the face to the company, has every right and authority to not accept the termination. So there are ways of helping yourself. If you do appoint a legal rep, make sure that just as a fair point upon appointment, that you have undated termination-related documents that potentially are kept by your lawyer, so that when they are terminated, the documents are readily there, that it can be taken to the government bureau and he can be replaced. You might want to get insurance indemnity for the people that are in these positions. It might make them feel safer, it might make them feel better. If you yourself, as an investor, are in any one of these roles, you might also want to have an indemnity insurance to protect yourself. Generally speaking, people in these roles are in charge of the chops, they're in charge of the bank account, they're in charge of the licenses. You might want to have internal operational guidelines and management directives for those individuals to make sure that none of these things are misused, right? You might want to say, okay, a director in China has only the authority to allow transfers of 100,000 renminbi and below. Anything above needs written approval, okay? So that if it does happen, you have an immediate sign. One of the biggest things that I tell my clients that are sitting abroad, get bank statements on a weekly basis. Take a look at the bank statements on a weekly basis. If you don't trust your staff to give it to you, have somebody else that you do trust give it to you, and have access also to the account then. But make sure you get the bank statements on a weekly basis so you know what is occurring. And the last point is obtain advice, right? Build your ecosystem of China experts. I can't emphasize this more. Don't just rely on the people you have newly hired on the ground to give you the best advice. Build your ecosystem of China experts in a variety of different fields and professions, that you have somebody you can call upon in case you need to. I have my lawyer's telephone number, mobile number, in my top 10 dialing options on my phone, just in case. Because again, I don't want to be caught into a situation like I have experienced in the past, okay? You want to have these people on your phone. I remember getting a phone call at 6:30 in the morning from a client who was sitting in his office because he had done an all-nighter, and an employee had come in completely outraged and was banging, and he felt very threatened by this employee, and he called me. I then told him to call the police, but he called me because he didn't know what to do. He was a foreigner, he was sitting in China, he had no idea what to do. He didn't even know that the police could speak English. They can. So you've got to build your ecosystem of China experts to guide you and help you at any moment with your entity in China. And if you're physically based there, to help you also physically get through situations like this if you're not familiar with them. So build your ecosystem. Now, one of the things that we have done at Woodburn Accountants and Advisors is we have devised a China roadmap for companies that are looking to grasp at opportunities, implement compliant and safe structures, and grow the business exponentially. And each company has their own unique journey in China. I've honestly never seen a company go through the same issues as somebody else. But what is identifiable is that everybody has certain milestones and strategies that can be implemented. So just to go through a little bit this China roadmap and relate it to how you can protect yourself from issues of fraud and other areas. The first stage is of being aware, right? So it's the opportunity stage. Is there an opportunity in China for your company, for your product, for your service? What is that opportunity, and what can you do to understand the level of this opportunity? So most people are at a stage where they've received an inquiry, they've received an email from somebody in China who says that they are an employee of a company and they're interested in their product. How are you aware of, how can you take that inquiry and know whether it is a viable inquiry? Well, the first thing you do, you have to educate yourself on the market. And the best way to do that is travel to China, network, see different cities, meet potential partners, meet the person you've inquired with. Is he really a part of that company? You've then got to do a bit of research on the market. Okay, without the research, how do you know if there's more opportunities available? You shouldn't just go to China for one opportunity. You should really look at the research. You should do a research on market segmentation, product testing, advertising testing, pricing research, competitor benchmarking, brand awareness. There's so many different forms of research that you can actually do to know whether China is the right opportunity for you. Once you've been educated, once you've done your research, then you can start building a strategy, right? Because you have actual data on your fingertips, allowing you to create a strategy, create a business plan, create a budget. The next point is then, oh, and let me look at a case study of this. So I'll never forget this because at the time I was lost in this meeting. I didn't know what was going on. But I had an Austrian company approach me. This must have been about 10 years ago. And they met with me in Shanghai. And we didn't really have an agenda planned out for the meeting. But the first thing that they said in the meeting was that they had a 40-foot container of product that had already been shipped 2 weeks ago, and in 4 weeks would be arriving at Shanghai port. Said fantastic, but in my mind I was thinking, okay, well, I'm not sure why they're meeting with me really. Their business is starting. You know, they've done all the education and research and they have a strategy if the shipment's already on the water. So when I started asking questions like, well, what business model have you already created? Who is your distributor? Who's receiving your products? And the more I started asking questions, the answers made me, I was dumbfounded. They had no distributor. Their freight forwarder was the consignee of the product. They had no idea who they were going to sell to. They just thought that they could bring their product in and with that 40-foot container, test it. But they had no network. They had no ecosystem. They knew nobody. They had done Google searches on who to meet, and then they wanted to meet me, which is wonderful, but They should have been meeting with customers, with clients. So what happened? Well, first of all, the goods arrived. Obviously, customs looked at the goods. There had been no quality control inspection that had occurred because this is a food item. So they didn't even know what was required to import food items into China. They didn't know that there were sample testings that had to occur first before food could be brought in from abroad. They didn't know about the labeling requirements in China. They knew nothing. The goods arrived at port and immediately they were shipped back, 12 weeks on the water. They pretty much threw away a 40-foot container. Okay, they had done no research. They had not been educated. Actually, what had occurred is they saw so much opportunity in the media that they just went ahead and sent a shipment. Obviously, 10 years on, people are being a bit smarter about it and they are educating themselves. But this is a real case study. This actually did happen. So research is about creating new knowledge and understanding what you can do in that market. The next stage is, or the next milestone would probably be considerations and implementation. And here I'm not necessarily referring to implementing a company in China. I'm referring to implementing your strategy, your business plan, okay? And that could mean that you're only planning to do things from abroad, or it could mean that you're actually looking to set up a company in China. It could be any of those things. It could be that for phase one is starting your business from abroad. Phase two is then incorporating and implementing something. Everybody is on a different China journey. Everyone is at a different stage, okay? But what everyone should do in the implementation stage is develop an ecosystem. Develop an ecosystem of partners so that you know what you can and cannot do in the market, and you have a group of advisors that can help you. These group of advisors will then protect you, which is the protection stage. They will advise you on intellectual property, corporate governance, due diligence, contract formulations, invoicing processes, how to do bank transactions. They will protect you. The next step is then developing system processes. So for those of you that are actually transacting from abroad, what this actually means is you will have a system process on how to sell your products into China with distributors, but you will know exactly about contract formulation. You will know exactly about logistics processes, customs clearance processes. You will know about protecting your brand and registering your brand. You will know about invoicing processes. How does the Chinese distributor pay you? You will know the insides and outsides of what he has to do to pay you, so that you have more knowledge about how things work. Or if things get delayed, why are they delayed? You'll have a comprehension level on that, okay? So this is the whole implementation stage. Now let's look at a case study on this. Again, preemption by action is the best protection. We had a client in the past who, because he was only producing in China for overseas markets, he never registered his trademark. He had over 100 suppliers in China. All the packaging with the brand name of the consumer products was done in China. He one day had a falling out with one out of the 100 suppliers, a very big falling out. That supplier lost face and registered the trademark in China. But not only did he register the trademark in China, he also then registered that trademark with the Customs Bureau. Do you know what that means? It means that all of the other 99 suppliers that wanted to ship product overseas could not. They were held up in customs because it had the brand name on the cartons. Okay? For a period of 3 months, no shipment could be exported unless the packaging was going to be done abroad, which meant that items had to be taken out of the packages and the boxes and then just shipped as the physical consumer product. But it was serious. And obviously the supplier had registered the trademark in bad faith. But if you look at the timeline, in order to prove that the guy had registered the trademark in bad faith, you're looking at years of litigation. So regardless of what you're doing in China, protect your brand, right? Because there are IP squatters that are sitting out there ready to take it. It's a form of fraud. All right. But if you don't protect yourself, we also had a client a long time ago who didn't even think that because they're offering services on the ground in China and it's not a product, they didn't have to register their trademark. It's the first thing I asked them to do. Register your trademark. You don't want your customers to steal it and use it in bad faith. Okay? So preemption by action is the best protection. Get your advisors who should be there to tell you what you need to do to make sure you are protected and your business is not halted in China so that it can grow. The third milestone, and I call it, that should be stage 3. Stage 3 is all about decisions. And the decisions are on the third milestone, which is growth. Once you know the opportunity and you've educated yourself, you've done the research, you've got a business plan, you've implemented, you've got your ecosystem, you're protected. And what was that last one? Oh my God, my memory is running out. You have your systems and processes in place. The next is you want to focus on growth. And how do you focus on growth? You can only focus, one, if your numbers are correct. Okay, I gave a presentation 2 weeks ago to a group of female entrepreneurs, and their biggest fear and worry was that they were not numbers people. It's very common. Most entrepreneurs are not numbers people. They're focused on being the entrepreneur. They have created a product or a service that they want to sell. They're passionate about that, but the numbers, they're kind of weak at. So the numbers are critical in terms of growth, and you want to make sure that your numbers are absolute, that they are correct, that they portray what is happening in the Chinese market. And as most people know, there's always 2 sets of books in China. That concept has to now be taken away. You need to have one good, valued set of numbers in China. Okay? Previously, people had 2 sets of books because they were trying to evade taxes. We got to get away from that mind frame. Okay, tax evasion is a big no-no in China, and tax bureaus are aware of it. So you want to make sure you're checking your numbers. You want to make sure you can read your numbers. You want to understand what PRC gap looks like in China. The second stage in growth is you want to analyze, and this is critical. So, there was a period of time where, as a corporate service provider, we were churning out, about 200, 250 management reports a month. No client ever came back and said, Christina, I don't understand the numbers. I don't understand why this is this. I don't understand why. Never. We were waiting for them to do it. They never came back. And most of the time I could tell, because at the year end, that's where most of the questions came in, no one was reading them. In China, you have the opportunity, you are required by law to produce monthly financial management reports. First of all, you should be reading them monthly. Second of all, you should be analyzing them monthly. Because if you are a newbie or a startup, even if you are an experienced China hand and you're in a bit of a stalemate, you want to understand why your business is not necessarily growing, or if it is growing, why is it growing? Okay, you've got to analyze what you're reading. You've got to analyze the different departments you have. And the last point is focus. When you're growing, you want to be able to focus on your core business. All of these numbers and analysis should be part of the system processes. They should be part of your monthly routine, okay? They should be the norm so that you can, on every other opportunity outside of analyzing it, focus on the core business and the growth of your business. So let's look at a case study that I formulated on this. Pay attention to everything and the truth will reveal itself. If you don't pay attention, you won't know what's happening under the table. I remember in the past, we had an Australian leather producer that established a joint venture in northern China. And he approached me after 3 years of establishment, and the Chinese joint venture partner was on the ground managing and running the business. And he approached me because he wanted to get a health check and an internal audit done, because their main question was, why are we not growing? Now, a lot of issues arose from this audit, or were discovered, or I had discovered out of this audit. The The first was financial management reports were only produced in Chinese. And when I asked the Australian leather producer whether he could read Chinese, he said no. And I said, well, why have you never asked for the English version of your financial management reports? And why are you not investing in a bilingual accounting software system? And his answer was, I didn't know I could. I didn't know it was allowed. I thought you could only produce Chinese versions. And I said, well, you can also get them translated yourself, so you know what it is. He was not paying attention to the business, and he hadn't paid attention since day one. This is the first point of fraud, lack of control and communication, right? What was discovered, just very simply through the financials, is one thing that we noticed was outside of payroll, there was a monthly transfer that was occurring to a specific individual who had the same last name as the Chinese joint venture partner. So we started asking questions, we started investigating the transfer, and we discovered there was no supporting documentation. There was no contract, no invoices, nothing. When we did a background check on this individual, we found out that he was the brother of the joint venture partner who was receiving quite a hefty amount on a monthly basis. And because nobody from Australia was paying attention or placing controls, the joint venture partner honestly thought he could get away with it by sending money to his brother, taking money out of the investment capital every month, basically. The pièce de résistance was also the fact that the joint venture partner had registered the trademark of the Australian partner in China without informing them. Because once they wanted to exit the relationship, it was discovered that actually they were tied to them because of the trademark registration by the Chinese joint venture partner that was in his own name. So we all know that joint ventures are like marriages. You know, probably the ratio is 50% will end up in divorce. Great, it ends up in divorce. But if you actually calculate the physical loss of investment capital, time, and resources that it took to negotiate that joint venture, find that partner, do the implementation, but then do the implementation so wrong that it led to this type of fraud. They were in years of litigation paying lawyers off and then not even focusing on the core business, which was to produce in China at lower prices and export. Okay, so the key is pay attention to your business. Don't lose control. Let me reflect back on the China roadmap. Okay, we're looking at awareness, consideration, decision, but we're looking at 3 different milestones. What is the opportunity in China? Implementing and looking at growth. Okay, missing any one of these steps can cause you to run into trouble and spend more of your time and more of your budget on fixing it than focusing on growth and focusing on the core activity that you actually want to achieve. So how can I help you? Well, there are 4 ways you can work with me to be protected. This is my little sales spiel, if you don't mind, but there are 4 ways you can work with me to be protected. The first, very simply, is advisory. I'm happy to talk with you about your experiences, what you've been doing, and how maybe you want to improve on those. We can also do health checks and internal audits just so that you feel like your company is going in the right direction. We can offer due diligences. We can also create internal control guidelines and procedures if you like. Now, if you are interested, please do book a strategy session with me. I'm going to try and type the link. Sorry, let me go back. That was wrong of me. I'm going to try and type the link now into the chat box so that you can set up a meeting with me. We can happily talk about anything that you are occurring or is occurring with you. So don't hesitate, set up a meeting with me and we can speak. Now, not many of you wrote in the chat box, which is a bit disappointing. And there are no questions that actually popped in either. But if you do have any questions right now, add them into the questions section of the control panel. Otherwise, add them also into the chat box. I am here for you. I am here to answer any questions you might have. If not, because everyone seems to be very quiet today, then don't hesitate again to set up a strategy session with me. I put the link into the chat box, and you're more than welcome to set up an appointment, and we can talk about developing a strategy to avoid fraud within your transactions or even within your business in China. Last but not least, we do have 2 more sessions within this workshop series. So we've got a session tomorrow on individual and corporate risks and precautions that foreign investors can do. We touched on it very briefly today. And the last one will be looking at audit and tax compliance requirements in China. You've got to start this process now if you do have an entity in China, because deadlines are approaching very soon within the new year. So if you haven't registered for those 2 sessions, please go ahead and do that. And like I said, if you want to have a meeting or you want to talk with me directly, don't hesitate to do so. I do want to thank everyone very much for joining me today. I hope you got something out of this webinar presentation. And I hope to see you all again very soon. Take care and have a great evening.